Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you managed to take a couple of minutes for the break to stretch your legs and get some fresh air, because I'm really very excited to introduce our next speaker, who will be speaking about Megillat Esther, Issues and Illusions. Rabbanit Yael Leibowitz holds a master's degree in Judaic Studies from Columbia University, and prior to making Aliyah, she taught Tanakh at the Upper School of Ramaz, and then went on to join the Judaic Studies facilities at Yeshiva University Stern College for Women. She's taught continuing education courses at many places, the Drisha Institute for Jewish Education. She served as a resident scholar at the Jewish Center of Manhattan and currently teaches at the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Learning at the Pardes Institute, while she continues her studies at Bar Ilan. So really delighted and honored that we've been able to arrange for Rabbanit Yael Leibowitz to join us today. I have to say, as soon as we contacted, she immediately said yes and very kindly agreed to address us. And really delighted that as I said before, the challenges of the current times also have given us the opportunities of being able to hear such a distinguished and learned speaker as Yael Leibowitz. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to her. I can't actually see you, Yael. I see you on the group, but I don't know if your screen is showing or not. I'm going to spotlight you. Yes, I'm going to spotlight you. And over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to learning Torah from you. And we'll follow the normal format, perhaps, which is I have muted everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask questions, and equally use the chat function. Perhaps don't send the chat to everyone because that can be a little distracting, but send it to me and I will take an opportune moment to ask the questions. And I think Yael will aim to finish a few minutes before 12:30, so that there'll be a little bit of time for questions if anyone has them. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing you. Over to you.
It could be, okay, amazing. Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. I don't know, Rabbi Zobin, what you agreed to with everyone. Do you want me to check the chats for questions? Do you want me to just let people unmute themselves? I'm happy with anything.
So I asked for people to, people can feel free to unmute themselves. But equally, I asked people to post questions. I suggested that they post the chat directly to me, so it doesn't distract you or the other people. And then I'll if there's something, I'll take a moment to interject. Otherwise, we'll just leave questions for the end. So maybe if you can just finish a couple of minutes before 12:30,
okay,
and then there'll be time for questions.
I'm hearing you a tiny bit choppy.
Okay, we can hear you
a tiny bit choppy. Am I clear for everyone else?
At the moment, you're clear. I'll try and contact you if for some reason you drop back out again.
All right, so I'll keep my phone on me. My apologies. Okay.
Okay.
So good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning for you. It's afternoon for me already. But I wanted to thank. Okay. I know there's some Zoom fatigue, as they call it, by this time of Corona. So I really just want to thank everyone for coming. It's really, really an honor to be able to speak to you from all the way in Israel. So I wanted to speak a little bit this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, about Megillat Esther. And Megillat Esther, one of the things that's very, very fascinating about it is actually what we call its early reception, meaning we know we love Megillat Esther, right? Purim is one of the highlights of our calendar. That goes without saying. In 1947, as the legend goes, there was a young Bedouin walking with his animals in the Judean desert, and he threw a little pebble into a cave, which is now worldwide known as the famous Qumran Caves. And the caves at Qumran were likely associated with the Assyrian text, and what they found there over the next few decades or so were close to 1,000 scrolls that were written and put together and sort of hidden, or at least saved by Jews living in that area of the desert. And essentially by the finding of that cave, aside from pushing back some of the oldest original texts of the books of Tanakh by a millennium, right? Until that point, some of the earliest works of Tanakh we had were from about the early Middle Ages. What finding the Dead Sea Scrolls did was give us tremendous insight into the Second Temple period, into the daily life of Second Temple Jews, into some of the sectarianism and the halachic differences that accounted for the schisms within the Jewish community. But most importantly for our discussion, and what I mentioned a moment ago when I said the early reception of different works of Tanakh, is that the finding of the scrolls really gave us a sense of the works that later became the works of Tanakh, right? The canonization did not happen during the Second Temple period. It happened a little later. We know that from discussions in the Gemara. And what finding the scrolls did really is give us a sense of what books were considered authoritative all the way from the 3rd through the 1st century CE. Okay, so meaning from the 3rd century BCE, when the Beit HaMikdash still stood, all the way through the 1st century CE to the time of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, when the canon hadn't yet been finalized. And one of the things that we found, which is really, really fascinating, is that every one of the books of Tanakh, even the shortest ones, even the ones that are only 1 or 2 prakim, you have Chagai, Zechariah, these tiny little Sfarim, and up to 3 copies of every work of Tanakh were found. There were close to 1,000 scrolls in total. The only one of the 24 books of Tanakh not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, among thousands of scrolls, was Megillat Esther. And it really raised a lot of important questions when the scrolls were found. And there were lots of speculations as to why. And some say that Megillat Esther wasn't yet known in the West because it was written by the Babylonian diaspora. But the truth is that that argument has actually been disproved based on quotations from various works found at Qumran, works outside of Tanakh that actually quote Megillat Esther. And then there are others that argue that they say that because the Qumran community had a different calendar, Purim would have fallen out on Shabbos. And so the book couldn't be included because Purim would have been problematic. And there's lots of different speculations. But regardless of all the speculations, one of the things that we understand from finding, again, every single one of the books of Tanakh, numerous copies of some of them, and 0 of Megillat Esther, is that it gives us really a first hint as to the questionable nature of the book of Esther in the years leading up to the formation of the Jewish canon. And by the way, I have to apologize ahead of time. I should have said this before. I'm going to share a screen with you of some of the sources I want to look through tonight. But in the interest of time, my apologies, I'm going to have to skip through many of them. But I will mention that they're found on the sheets as I cover them. So I'll mention them, you could feel free to look through the sources as I refer to them, and some of them I'm going to want to take the time to look at inside. But one of the things that we sort of have, and one of the things we begin to understand, is that there was a sense in the early years leading up to the formation of the Jewish canon that Megillat Esther was not necessarily unanimously accepted. On your sheets there, and I'm not going to read it inside, but feel free to look at it. Most of you, I imagine, have heard of Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu, the famous Jewish historian who moved to Rome after the failed revolt of the Jews against the Romans and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. One of the things he did was he wrote a history of the Jewish people. And aside from the history that it provides, it gives us a great sense, really, of some of the prevalent attitudes that were circulating in the Jewish communities during the 1st century CE. And one of the things which is really fascinating, apropos of this conversation, is that in his work called Antiquities of the Jews, he speaks of the canon, right, of the Tanakh, and he mentions 22 books. Now, he doesn't say what those 22 books are. So again, it opens up a whole big Pandora's box of scholarly debate as to what exactly comprises the 22. But many are of the opinion, for a variety of reasons, that Josephus didn't count Esther and Kohelet as part of the Hebrew Bible. Okay. And again, I don't want to run out of time. I want to make sure to leave time for questions. So I'm not going to read the Gemara inside, but one of the things that the Gemara also addresses, now the Gemara is written after the Tanakh was already finalized, after it was decided which books are going to be included and which are not. And yet in the Gemara as well, they question the halachic concept of whether or not Megillat Esther is mitamat hayadayim, which is a really fascinating halachic discussion that we don't have time to address tonight. Maybe some other time we can get into it. It's really, really interesting. But essentially the question of whether Esther is mitamat hayadayim is really addressing the question of whether or not Esther is considered kadosh, whether Esther is considered a work that should or should not be included in the canon, in the Tanakh. And so again, already after the Tanakh was already closed and it wasn't reopened. We know that once the Tanakh was sealed, there was no reopening, but still in the period of the Amoraim, the authors of the Gemara are entertaining this hypothetical debate or this controversy, really for lack of a better word, that is still being referred to even later on. And it's reflected in the discussions being had anywhere from 400 to 800 years after its initial composition, okay? Now, no one is really sure, right? And we can only work backwards and try to figure out why certain works were included in Tanakh while others were left out. We know that there were some fascinating, really, really fascinating works of Tanakh that we imagine might have been included because they're so similar to other works we know of, or because they really include this brilliant level of sort of theology and philosophy that were excluded from Tanakh. And we really don't know, and the Gemara tries to sort of outline certain criteria. But we're really only familiar for the most part with the Sfarim and Tanakh that made it in, right? But there were a lot of others that were circulated and considered authoritative during the Second Temple period. And so the only thing that we could really try to do is make sense of the questionable status of Esther and try to compare the Sefer to maybe other works or other themes or other trends in Tanakh that we're familiar with, and see how Esther sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, and why so many centuries after it was actually written, and so many centuries after it was even popular within the land of Israel, the Qumran sect chose to ignore it. The Gemara, the Amoraim were still debating it. Right? Now, again, I wish we had more time. I keep looking at my clock. I don't want to run out of time. If we did, I would now open up the floor and ask you guys what you think is strange about Megillat Esther. And I imagine many of you may have lots of thoughts. Now, one of the things I'm actually going to ask you to do is shelf any midrashim you know of Megillat Esther. One of the things that Midrash does, which is really fascinating for a whole host of other reasons, is take all the strange things we know about Megillat Esther and sort of push them aside and make Megillat Esther sort of more Hamish and more in line with the other works of Tanakh that we're familiar with. Okay? One of the topics I'm going to get to a little bit later on is the fact that Hashem's name is not mentioned, right? And that's a really, really big theological question. And for those of you that might be familiar, the Midrash says that every time the word Melech appears, it's a hint to Hashem. Okay. Now, we're not ignoring Midrash, we're not undermining it, we're not negating it, but I do want to put it on the side because we have to assume that the earliest audience of Tanakh, the earliest readers, meaning the people that had Megillat Esther when it was first being written and circulated, did not have the Midrashim to accompany it. And so what I want to sort of begin to look at and start to think about is, what is the message Megillat Esther was communicating to its audience? You know, we think of Tanakh as sort of this monolithic, stable corpus of 24 books of Tanakh that all seem to agree with each other and have the same message. But one of the things that's really, really interesting to do is begin to look at the Sfarim in Tanakh and ask ourselves, what are the authors? What are the people that were writing the Nevi'im? What issues were they addressing? Right? If a rabbi today gets up in shul and gives a speech and gives a Dvar Torah, so in 100 years from now, someone can look back at the quotation of that rabbi's speech and say, that's so interesting. The community must have been dealing with this, this, and this issue. And the rabbi addressed it in his weekly sermon by talking about these and these issues. And lahavdil, really, that's what most of the Sfarim in Tanakh are like. Right? So for some, it's easier. For Yirmiyahu, we know he's talking to the people about repenting so the Beit HaMikdash is not destroyed. For, in Sefer Shemot, we know that we're discussing and we're teaching our children about Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we're teaching them the Mitzvoth and about Har Sinai. But really, every Sefer in Tanakh should be looked at that way, should be looked at through the lens of, what did the specific author of this specific Sefer feel his community needed to hear, okay? Or not fit into the typical model that we might be used to when we talk about regular Sfarim Sfarim in Tanakh. First and foremost, and this is maybe perhaps the most obvious thing, and I hope some of you were sort of thinking in your minds about what might make Megillat Esther a little strange. Megillat Esther was written outside of Israel, right? and not only outside of Israel, and one of the few books to be, or the only really book to be written outside of Israel, with the exception of Yecheskel and parts. Megillat Esther seems to be totally unconcerned with the events that were taking place in Israel. Okay, now just to give us like a little bit of a time of a context, the Beit HaMikdash, the first temple, was destroyed in 586, and the Jews were led out to Bavel. In 539, the first Achaemenid king, Cyrus the Great, allowed the Jews, actually, you guys should all be going to the British Museum, if you haven't seen it yet, to see the Cyrus cylinder, the decree that Cyrus made when he took over, when he conquered the Babylonians and started sort of ruling in Persia and beyond. He allowed the Jews to go back to Israel and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and that was what we call Shivat Zion, under the auspices of Zerubbabel and then later Ezra Nehemiah. Okay? The story of Purim doesn't happen until the days of Xerxes, King Xerxes, Achashverosh, which was not until 486, approximately, or probably even a little later, between the years 486. So almost, right, close to a century after the Jews had already gotten back to the land of Israel. And one of the things that we know was happening in the days of Ezra Nehemiah were all of these sort of trials and tribulations that the Jews from the period of Shivat Zion were facing in terms of economic hardship, in terms of religious crises, etc. Okay? So we look at this Megillah, Megillat Esther, that's written in Persia, that's focusing on all these Persian issues, and there's no mention of the Jews in Israel. There's no mention at all of the community in Israel. Right? It talks about the, and again, we know that there was already a sizable portion of Jews living in Jerusalem. It was not a good time for them. And Megillat Esther doesn't seem to mention them, seems to be totally unconcerned with their reality. Megillat Esther doesn't mention the Beit HaMikdash, which was already standing during the days of Xerxes. And so the fact that it seems to be so utterly unconcerned in Israel to sort of swallow in those days when they were deciding what books should belong in the canon. Okay, that's the first thing that I think sort of makes the most sense. By the way, just again, consult with your source sheets, but one of the things you'll find there, which is really, really fascinating, I'll just check to see actually which source number it is so I could direct you a little bit better. You have there on source number, on source number, there you have the Cyrus cylinder for everyone to see. And here, source number 9 is actually fascinating just as a point of comparison of Egypt. And we know that there was excellent communication between the community in Elephantine and the community in Jerusalem. And they would even ask the Kohen Gadol in Yerushalayim questions about when holidays fell out, etc. And so if we compare that relationship and the sort of, ongoing mutual respect between the Elephantine community and the community in Jerusalem, and then we read Megillat Esther and we say, whoa, hey, where's Jerusalem? Where's mention of the high priests? So that's something that I think might have raised some question marks for the Jews living in Jerusalem. Okay, that's the first thing. I think the other thing which is pretty obvious, right? And again, it goes without saying for those of us that are going to temporarily shelve all the midrashim that we learned, is that Megillat Esther is really devoid of any religious content, right? And again, if we just compare it, and I brought some examples on your source sheets. If we just compare, for example, to Sefer Daniel, actually last year I taught an entire course comparing the approaches to exile in Megillat Esther and Sefer Daniel. And one of the things that we realize about Megillat Esther when we compare it to Sefer Daniel, right? Now Sefer Daniel is a good point of comparison because both Mordechai and Esther were court Jews. Both made it high up in the ranks in their foreign, right, in the foreign courts. Both were respected by their, by the Babylonian Empire and, et cetera, et cetera. It sort of has the similar model of the Yosef, Mordechai, Esther, Daniel court Jew and how they remain or how they perform in a foreign environment. One of the things we see is that Daniel was scrupulous in the Babylonian court with his observance of Mitzvoth at great risk to himself. And so he was very, very careful never to eat non-kosher, to the point of almost starving. He was very, very fastidious about his prayer. He would always look out the window and pray towards Yerushalayim. He was very careful to maintain the highest sort of religious stringencies, even if it meant compromising not only his position in the court, but his own life. Okay. So again, if we compare Sefer Daniel, and then we look at Mordechai and Esther, who seem to be eating at the eating at the parties of the king, and I don't have to mention the distance or the dichotomy between the model pious, religious, devout Jew Daniel, who was able to maintain his religiosity despite these social and cultural challenges, and we hold Daniel up against Esther and Mordechai. And again, we don't want to say they were more assimilated. What we're looking at is that the Megillah itself doesn't seem to be concerned with whether or not they were assimilated. Okay, meaning it's very possible that Esther only ate salad at the parties, but the Megillah doesn't seem to address it. Whereas the author of Sefer Daniel, who's addressing different concerns of his respective community, makes sure that his audience knows how religious Daniel was. And so again, it sort of raises that question. By the way, I will mention one of the things, and if any of you can get a hand on it, there's a fantastic book by a man by the name of Michael Fox, who talks about, we have our Megillat Esther, the Hebrew version, but the early Greek-speaking Jewish communities had their translations of Megillat Esther, the what we call Targum Shivim, right? The Septuagint and other Greek translations done for Jews that in all likelihood were more comfortable reading texts of Tanakh in Greek as opposed to Hebrew. So one of the things we notice in the Greek translations of Megillat Esther is that all the things we seem to have trouble with, they sort of add little pieces. It's what we call the Greek additions to the Megillah, where they sort of make Megillat Esther and the personalities in Esther just a little bit more Hamish. So you have, for example, Mordechai having a dream, which makes him almost like a prophet. And we have Esther fasting and davening, right? Because a fast, it's not entirely clear what that is. In the Greek edition, she also davens. In the Greek edition, she doesn't eat the non-kosher food, and she doesn't want to marry the king, which, by the way, the Gemara also talks about, right? The Gemara mentions that Esther is karka, right? That Esther did not want to marry the king, and everything in their relationship, she was sort of a passive object to sort of get her off the hook for being intermarried. And so one of the things that we notice is that all the things that sort of raise flags for us, and we say, hey, that seems a little strange that Megillat Esther has all these weird components to it. Early Jews, even already in the first centuries of the Common Era, were adding their own additions so that they could feel comfortable with what we feel are problematic. Okay? What I want to do, though, is rather than entertain those additions, and obviously the midrashim that sort of address all of those issues, I want to look back and say the text on its pshat level, the text as it appears to us, that the author knew what Svarim of Tanakh looked like. He or she could have included all those other things that the Greek Jews include in their version. The author of Megillat Esther wrote with a specific intent in mind. And so what I want to do is sort of look at what that unique message may have been. The Megillah itself is, as with every Sefer in Tanakh, right? The narrative or the poetic portions is the packaging in which the author is communicating his worldview, his theology, his unique messaging. And so what I want to do is try to understand what that unique messaging is, okay? Now, one of the things, and again, by the way, I just want to also be clear, because I mentioned, Daniel, by incorporating all, Tanakh incorporates lots of different voices, right? So we have in the beginning, Breshit talks about Hashem as omnipotent and Hashem creating the world, and then Shemot talks about a different facet of Hashem that chooses Israel as his people, right? So you might have Eov dealing with a God that seems to be overly strict and overly harsh, and he doesn't see the justice in the world. And then we have Yonah, who's too compassionate, right? Hashem forgives people too easily. And one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we study Tanakh is that the Chazal, by incorporating all these different voices, wants us to entertain all those different ways of thinking and all those different worldviews, because there isn't one right way. Right? There isn't one ideal. There's all the sort of entire spectrum of the human experience represented in the 24 books of Tanakh. And so our job as students of Tanakh is to try to look at what that unique messaging of that specific sefer is. So what I wanted to do is, I feel like I'm so short on time. Okay. What I wanted to do is begin with one of the literary features of the Megillah, which really in and of itself is not going to answer our question regarding the inclusion of the work in Tanakh, but I think it's going to help highlight some of those major themes and elements in the book that lend it authority when it comes to the topic of diaspora and the diaspora experience and sort of the anomalous status, so to speak, of Megillat Esther. And the best way I would think about describing it, and it's found on that first, let me just open it for me, sorry. It's found, I just have to move my own face, my apologies, I can't see my sources. It's found in that first parak, okay, in Megillat Esther. And we're not going to read through the entire thing. But if we look, some of you that were familiar with studying Tanakh, I'll just give you by way of example. So Sefer Shoftim Megillat Ruth begins, Vayi b'mei Shvot HaShoftim, Vayi Av Ba'aretz. It begins in the days of Shoftim. It gives us the time context, and it tells us one thing that's essential for us to understand the plot. There was a famine, and so we move into the next, right, sort of action sequence. And so Elimelech and his family moved to Moab and everything that unfolds from there. That's how Megillat Ruth begins. And if we look for most part in Tanakh, we don't get detailed accounts or detailed descriptions of what things looked like or how things seemed or how things worked. The only time in Tanakh we ever get actually a detailed description of how anything even looked is the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. Right? If I said to you, David built this unbelievable palace for himself in Yerushalayim after he conquered Yerushalayim, what did it look like? We have no idea. Right? The only thing we know is what the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash looks like, with the exception of the first paragraph in Megillat Esther. The very first chapter begins. And again, I don't want to run out of time, so I'll let you guys read it on your own time. But what you'll notice is it gives a very vivid description. And not only does it give a very vivid description, but it mentions all types, all the textures, all the textiles, all the metals and the marble, everything that was being used in the palace and sort of describing the party. And we as readers are almost lulled into the party. We're sort of dragged into it. And as we're reading that first parak, we're imagining it. We could see the alabaster columns and we could see all the purple dyed cloth surrounding us, and we're imagining the taste of the wine. And so we're drawn in. And one of the things we notice all Megillah PURIM, you'll see all these loan words from Persia that we don't actually know what they mean. Right? There's all these, they have these, it talks about Chel, Parasu, Madai, and then it lists all the different hierarchy and the different types of people that were leading, that helped the king. So on the one hand, we're enamored by what we see. On the other hand, we kind of feel out of place because we don't know what Achashtar Pnei HaMelech means, right? We don't know what the Persian loan words mean. And so we have this sort of eerie experience of, on the one hand, being enamored by the luxury, and on the other hand, being sort of caught off guard that we're not exactly sure what we're looking at or where we stand in this foreign place. Okay, and so what that does really, if you think about it, is the author of Megillat Esther is almost crafting the reading experience where we as readers, right, it's the difference between, if you think about it, watching a movie on a television where you still see the couch and your cup of coffee on the side and your kids are still screaming in the background, or putting on VR, right, virtual reality glasses and being in a chair that's moving with you as the roller coaster is moving. And that experience doesn't compare. So Megillat Esther, on some level, what it's almost doing is creating a reading experience where we're drawn into the experience of the characters themselves. We almost identify with the Jews that are in this gorgeous, luxurious palace, wanting to partake of the food, feeling a little bit off kilter because they're not entirely sure what this new strange world is about, but being almost drawn into it. right? We have this also, and I'm not going to read it inside, but check on your sheets. We have this also in the opening when we talk about the characters in the Sefer itself. One of the things that we look at is that we have a lot of times where the private thoughts of the person is exposed, and other times where the private thoughts of the person is completely ambiguous to us. Right? And I'm going to give it to you almost as an assignment. When you read the Megillah, pay attention. I'm going to give you a little hint here. Obviously, it goes without saying. But one of the things we'll notice is that the heroes, so for example, Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman. We have no idea why. It causes all this trouble in the Megillah. Everything Haman wants to do after and all his decision to destroy the Jews all hinges on the fact that Mordechai didn't want to bow down. The Megillah gives us no insight into Mordechai's inner thoughts. Right? On the other hand, one of the things that we have over and over consistently is insight into the thoughts of the king. We know exactly when he's angry. We know exactly when his anger has subsided. We know exactly what he's troubled by and how people can talk to him and make him feel better. And by the way, the same goes goes for right. Haman fantasizes about his renown, and we get into the inside of his head. And so what the author is doing, again, is sort of creating this sense where we are the diaspora Jews. We are the Jews in a foreign world. We are trying to succeed. We're trying to build a new life, but we're so consumed by the details that perhaps we lose sight of the larger issues. Perhaps when we're trying so hard to just make a go at it in this foreign place, maybe we even forget about the Beit HaMikdash temporarily. Right? And when we're so caught up in the fact that we have a leader whose thoughts are so easily read and who's so easily manipulated by the people around him, so then we know that we have to constantly be on guard, right? One of the things you'll notice as you're reading through the Megillah is how easily Ahasuerus is manipulated by the people around him. And that has everything to do with how easily he's being read. He gets angry, the people around him know to rally around and do whatever it takes to sort of assuage his anger and his fury. And then as soon as they make him feel good about himself, as soon as they, right, to sort of show him yakar v'gedulato, then all of a sudden his anger abates. And once he finds a wife that's more obsequious and that doesn't defy him, then he's happy again, and then he can make another party. So again, the Megillah is doing is almost giving us the experience of being a Jew in a foreign land. It's giving us the experience of how on edge we feel because safety seems so tenuous, because the king could be great to us one day, but if he gets angry, he'll take his signet ring off and hand it to the person who's best manipulates him and says, go have a Holocaust, right? No, and he sort of, claims to have nothing to do with it. So the author enables us to, again, have all of those conflicting experiences. On the one hand, being enamored by this world of luxury. On the other hand, right, and everything that comes with it, and sort of being lost in that world. On the other hand, feeling vulnerable and knowing that there may be nothing that could stop a genocidal decree once it's approved. And the ease with which we read Ahasuerus's moods really talks about the fear that Jews have when their fate is completely contingent on people that run the country, and they're just the minority. They're the Am Echad Mefuzar Umeforad. Right? So the author does all of that because he's speaking to the audience that needs to hear it. He's not speaking to the Jews that live with the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim under the Jewish rule. He's not speaking to Jews with hegemony. He's speaking to Jews who have all of those vulnerabilities as part of their day-to-day experience. Right? So all the things that, again, on the surface seem so weird, seem so strange, seem so out of character for a Sefer in Tanakh, is actually part and parcel of what makes the Sefer so powerful for the people experiencing what the characters in the Megillah go through. Okay? I want to mention one thing, last really thing, that I think is the most important, maybe even of all of those things that we mentioned. I think all the different things that we mentioned sort of get us into the mind frame of a diaspora Jew, get us into the mind frame of how scary it must be to live, right, sort of at the whim of a foreign dictator. But there's one other thing also that I think more than anything speaks to the heart of the exilic experience and was unique in Esther's day and really in many ways unprecedented in Tanakh. I mentioned earlier the theology, right, of Megillat Esther as being different in different works of Tanakh. And one of the things that makes Megillat Esther so unique is that it's the only, and I'm excluding Sefer Mishlei now for 1 second, but Megillat Esther is the only narrative portion in Tanakh where Hashem's name is not mentioned, and where Hashem or God, divine intervention altogether remains hidden. But I say hidden and not absent, because I think that Megillat Esther, the author, really does something very, very fascinating. Hashem's name is never mentioned directly, right? That we know. But if we actually look inside, I have to move the screen over again. If we actually look inside, one of the things we find is that there are actually hints to Hashem all throughout the Sefer, okay? So it says, for example, if you look in source 20, for example. Actually, we can even go back to source 19. Source 19, it talks about all these things, right? It mentions he remembers his wife Vashti, and it just happens to be that Esther is chosen, right? And then in Parag Gimel, it talks about the people of Israel and how Haman wants to kill them, and how the king takes his ring off and hands it to Haman, and we're worried that there is going to be absolute genocide. Okay. And then in chapter 7, things begin to turn. And in chapter 7, and we all remember the sort of climax of Esther's career, where Mordechai tells her that, sort of this is her moment in history to decide if she wants to identify with the Jewish people and secure their future, or sort of be lost to the vicissitudes of history. And one of the things that we watch Esther doing is perfectly manipulating the king and saving her people. And what we have again after her saving the people are these perfect inversions, right? What we call the Nahafochu. We sing the song V'nahafoch, V'nahafoch, V'nahafochu. What the song is referring to is how every single detail of Haman's plan to obliterate the Jewish people ends up, read through the Megillah this year, I think hopefully you'll look at it, and you'll notice that every single thing that happens is this perfectly, right? It's almost perfectly serendipitous. The fact that Haman happens to be walking in Achashverosh's garden in the middle of the night, just when Achashverosh can't sleep, and just when he opens up the book to the page that happens to have Mordechai on it. And so there's, on the one hand, it's almost actually Michael Fox, the book that I referred to a moment ago, uses, I think, the best metaphor to speak about the theology of Megillat Esther. He says it's almost like an optical illusion, right? Everyone's seen optical illusions where you could look at a picture, a black and white drawing of an old woman, and then if you stare at it long enough, all of a sudden you start to see the beautiful young woman's right neck and the side of her cheek. And then you look at it again a minute later when you look away and you look back, and there's the old lady again, and you can't even remember seeing the young woman, right? Megillat Esther, in terms of Hashem being present, is actually a lot like that, right? If you look at source 21, it says, "Vayisaper Haman leZeresh Ishto." He tells everyone exactly what his plans are, and how things are unfolding. And Zeresh, his wife, says to him, it's in the middle of that line, source 21, "Im mizera haYehudim Mordechai asher chilota linpol lefanav lo tuchal lo ki nafol tipol lefanav." Right? What is making this foreign woman make a statement that's so true and so historically accurate, right? And little by little, we watch every single thing that Haman did unfold in favor of the Jewish people, and sort of come smacking him in the face and working against him. And so one of the things that Megillat Esther, I think, does for us, and again, does it because it's mirroring the exilic experience, is that it hides all these perfect coincidences, and it hides all these reversals, and it hides the theme of Israel's deliverance from the enemy. But we don't see miracles. We don't see the 10 plagues. We don't see the splitting of the sea. We see the Jewish community coming together. And so on the one hand, right, and again, this is perfectly fitting for the diaspora community, for Jews that no longer have Nevi'im walking among them, for Jews that no longer have Moshe picking up his stick and turning the Nile River into blood. It's the quintessential experience of a diaspora Jew, a Jew where God is no longer apparent, is exactly the experience that we have when we're reading the Megillah. because we see the perfect coincidences and we assume Hashem must be there. But then we look back the next day and we say, wait, is Hashem there or was that just coincidence? Right? Where is Hashem? Is he with us? Will he see to it that things work out, that we're protected? And again, by definition, Galut entails a distance from Hashem, but it's the very uncertainty that comes with that distance. Right? We talk about, and again, we see this still today. Things happen to the Jewish people. Look at the 6-day war, right? I live in Israel. So you talk about Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim, and you have Jews that say there's no question God's hand was there and every step of the way was a miracle. And then you have people that say, no, it was our military and it was our strategy and it was the surprise and everything else. And so one of the sort of quintessential experience of Galut is that we're never actually entirely sure what we're looking at. And Megillat Esther, just like it creates the sense of luxury in that first parak, and just it creates the sense of understanding being in the characters' heads in the second and third parak, what it does throughout the Sefer is raises the question, is this a miracle or is this serendipity? Is it Hashem intervening on behalf of the Jewish people or is it coincidence? And the Megillah never answers that question, because at the end of the day, we're never given an answer to that question, right? At the end of the day, if we choose to see coincidence or we choose to see miracles in our daily lives, it comes down to us and what we choose to focus on and what we choose to see. And so I think that, going back to our original question, right? Why is Megillat Esther included if it's so strange? And if we keep the Midrashim aside, I think that the text itself, it's the very elements that made the Sefer questionable, that when taken together account for its popularity, right? Was Esther able to keep kosher when she was doing that? Was Mordechai able? We don't know. Right? Because that's something that Jews are constantly conflicted by. That's something that is always the ability to sort of maintain your religious standards in a foreign world when there's pressure, when there's culture. That's always a question. And so all the things that were left gray, all the things that were left sort of as unknowns are left that way because the unknown and the conflict and the gray and the dichotomies is part and parcel of the exilic experience. And I think what Megillat Esther is doing, or the author of Megillat Esther, rather than tying everything up with a perfect bow, is reflecting that experience. But I think at the same time, while it's saying that everything is unknown and power is tenuous and our position in exile is vulnerable, and while we might be down one day and up the next day, we could be down the next day again, there's one thing that the Megillah is really emphatically clear on, and that's I think personally, I think it's the way in which the Jews within the Persian Empire work together, and how when the time came and they were called upon by their leaders, right? We don't know how religious they were. We don't know if they were keeping kosher. What we do know is that when their leader asked, they fasted together and they fought together. And when the time came, they celebrated together. Right? It's fascinating. Megillat Esther, every other holiday we have ends with korbanot, ends with a rededication of the Beit HaMikdash, or ends with bringing, sacrifices to the Mikdash in Yerushalayim. Megillat Esther, and I have it. It's that last source on your sheets. Megillat Esther concludes with the charge for the mitzvot of the day, and we don't talk about Hallel and we don't talk about korbanot. And again, where in a different sefer would expect the mitzvot in the form that we're familiar with. Purim, basically, the mitzvot is eat, drink, and be merry, right? You're not sitting in a sukkah to commemorate a miracle. You're not lighting a menorah. You're sitting together and you're eating together and you're giving out mishloach manot and you're giving out tzedakah, because after sitting in shul, sorry, I realized my sources were up there the whole time. After sitting in shul and not just listening passively to the Megillah, but as the author intended, experiencing the Megillah, walking through the experience of exile, all of the fear and all of the release and all of the comic relief and all of the perfect coincidences where we're looking for Hashem and we don't know if he's there, but we're hoping to find him. More than anything else, at that moment, when we walk out of shul, what we want to do is reach out to members of our community and renew that sense of camaraderie through mishloach manot, by looking around to see if there's a single person among us that can't afford food that we can provide for. Because at the end of the day, what Megillat Esther, I think, makes the argument is that there is nothing in exile we can be sure of. The only thing we can rely on is our togetherness, is our community, is what we can do when we despite our differences, unite as a people against our common enemy. And so we're sitting in shul and Megillah, and we're terrified, as we should be. And then we walk out with a renewed sense of pride in the Jewish community and understanding how important it is to take care of us and to remain united. I think, I know I have 1 second left to say something. I think Corona has taught us anything. I don't know how locked up you guys still are in England, but if Corona has taught us anything, it's how badly we need each other and how badly we need community. And so that's really ultimately what Megillat Esther is about. It raises the fears, it raises the unknown, it raises the vulnerabilities, it raises all of the gray and all of the again, optical illusions that the experience of exile is about. The only thing it makes clear is that if we stick together as a community, that's ultimately the greatest strength that we have and the greatest strength that we can rely on. And so with that in mind, Rabbi Zobin, I'll open up to questions. I know I apologize, that was kind of rushed. But I think in today's day and age, perhaps more than ever, that message is really, really relevant and should resonate with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for that sweeping vision of PURIM, the Megillah, contextualizing it within the understanding that perhaps recent archaeological evidence has brought to light and the historical perspective. Thank you. Maybe I'll just take this chance to pick up on a couple of points you mentioned and plug some programming that's coming up. You mentioned the British Museum and our unique opportunity to see it. Next Sunday evening, 8 p.m, Michelle Sintz will be giving a virtual tour of some of the artifacts in the British Museum and tying them into the PURIM story. So please take advantage of that. This does need, this particular session needs signing up in advance, registering in advance. So I'll give a quick plug for that next Sunday evening, 8 p.m. You concluded by mentioning the importance of us as a community pulling together and actually in general, some of the challenges around COVID to our health and our well-being. Just again, then a quick plug this evening at 7:45 p.m. We have a health and well-being series with Mrs. Debbie Gross. I'll be offering some words of chizuk. And again, please sign up and please join that this evening. Everyone has been impacted by COVID differently, but there are commonalities and we're all dealing with loss of normal life and much of what's important to us. So this is a session that hopefully will provide some really practical tools to dealing with that. Maybe if I can just use the power of the floor to ask the first question. It's
Sure.
Not my own question, actually, several people have posted it in the chat. Looking at the historical timelines of some of the events, and certainly Chazal's understanding of some timelines was slightly different from the usual tradition that Achashverosh miscalculated the expiration of the 70 years since the Churban, bringing it to early. So if the Churban occurred in 586, the events of PURIM would be about sometime before 516, rather than 486 or later. And also, perhaps just the second Beis Hamikdash wasn't rebuilt. Cyrus stopped the rebuilding, and it's only continued to completed after the PURIM story, as per the Gemara Megillah by Dayavish. So just your understanding of the timeline and the sort of relationship between the historical sources and Chazal.
Oh wait, I just lost you.
Were you able to hear that, or did you lose me there?
Right. So it's a really fascinating question. I heard it. I got a tiny bit chopped off, but I heard most of it. I will say, for a very, very long time, the order of the Achaemenid kings and actually the years of the Persian dynasty wholesale was kind of lost to us, and it was very, very unclear. And Chazal were sort of working off of memories of a couple of hundred years earlier, and so the chronology was somewhat off. And then in the mid 1800s, actually, with the discovery of the Neo-Babylonian tablets and essentially the Behistun inscription, which is basically a carving on the side of a mountain where they were able to start to decipher different cuneiform works and able to really trace and begin to understand a lot of the works that have been lost because they couldn't decipher it. They were able to sort of create order out of history. And one of the things that I think, if I have to guess, or at least what scholars sort of speculate as to where Chazal got confused, is that there were a number of kings that had similar names. And so you were translating from Greek into Hebrew, and then from transliterating essentially from Greek into Hebrew. So you have, for example, Xerxes, and then Xerxes II, and an Artaxerxes, and another Artaxerxes. And so, I think the years very, very much got confused. But if we're working on the sort of historical timelines, both from Herodotus and from the other, Persian texts that we have, extant texts. So it would have fallen, the reign of Xerxes would have certainly been once Bnei Israel were back in the land of Israel. And that, I think that raises, again, like I mentioned, a lot more questions in terms of where the consciousness of the community is. There's actually, some people mention there's in Ezra Nehemiah itself, there's actually a pasuk in Ezra Nehemiah that says, Ubimei Achashverosh katvu sitna al haYehudim. And there are some that argue that that sitna that they're mentioning is not necessarily dealing with the Samaritan issue that they're dealing with in Israel proper, when they're trying to perhaps referring to the sitna, that the Megillah is referring to. It's kind of not everyone, there's no unanimity on that one, but there are certainly people that like to see the connection between the two works of Tanakh. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you for the answer. I'm conscious that we have run out of time, so I don't want people to feel they need to stay on. But if anyone has a question, please, now is your chance to ask it. But thank you so much to all of you for joining over this wonderful morning of learning, and thank you so much, Yael Leibowitz, for those words and that massive information and insight and wisdom and chizuk that you shared with us. Also, thank you.
Pleasure. I don't know if I could see I think I could see the chat box, but I didn't see questions coming in.
No, I asked people to post them in the introduction that I gave before you